I am at the third section of this second lecture about Haldeman, and I'm now talking about the medical machine. And I have been sort of pointing at this before, but especially with Johnny Got His Gun. But here we come to what it will look like in the future, presumably. And you're right. Mandela notes about medicine on Earth, and this should sound familiar, right? They'd made great strides in treatment of gunshot wounds in the past 20 years. Lots of practice on 143. Now remember that this is what Joe Bonham says, right? About, he says, they could do all kinds of things to save you if they got to you early enough. Evidently, they had gotten to him soon enough. So the idea then is the doctor becomes a sort of body mechanic. And this became a very useful image, a very resonant image during and after the Vietnam War, partly because there were so many damaged bodies and because people survived. And the same thing is true now, where we've got people surviving from the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, where they otherwise wouldn't, partly because they can be picked up off the battlefield and moved so quickly to a good base hospital, and then moved from there to Landstuhl in Germany, which is where they were taken next. So they actually could be, on the battlefield, and 3 or so hours later, they might actually, or 3 or 4 hours later, they might actually be in a European country and in an emergency room, neurology, in front of a neurological surgeon. And what that means is that you've got people who are being saved who wouldn't have made it 30, 40 years ago, when medicine looked pretty good already. What that also means is that you've got 20-year-olds who are in excellent physical shape, who are vegetables, basically. And even the neurosurgeons are saying, Jesus, we shouldn't be saving these people. I mean, they're basically, what their existence now is going to be vegetative. They have zero chance of recovering. They're going to be taken home to the United States, and they will probably have to be put into full-time care facilities where they will be kept alive forever. I mean, until they get an infection and die. So the result, this is partly because of the result of very simple armor. I was talking about complex armor a minute ago, but the armor we're talking about now is very simple, but actually having personal armor being worn by the troops, and it's well-made personal armor that, the rule is, you don't walk around with just your shirt on. Means that if there's a blast, as there often is from below, if you're going to get hit by some kind of blast, it'll be directed upwards to the face and the head by the armor itself. And that's what's going to cause a traumatic brain injury. So the armor saving the torso and the heart, of course, and all the internal organs, but it's hitting the brain. And so you've got now a body which is fine, relatively, and you've got a brain which has been damaged beyond repair. Mandela has this relationship with the doctors, which is that he sees them fundamentally as technicians, as mechanics. We were being ignored by the ship's 2 doctors who stood in bright light at operating tables, absorbed in blood rituals on 167. Squinting into the bright light, the blood on their green tunics could have been grease, the swathed bodies odd soft machines that they were fixing. But the machines would cry out in their sleep, and the mechanics muttered reassurances while they plied their greasy tools. I watched and slept and woke up in different places. And this is all on page 167. Now, I have some images of this for you, or maybe it's later. Must be later. I will show you some images from the graphic novels, because a Dutch artist took on the making the Forever War and then the Forever Peace, Forever Free, into graphic fiction And it did a pretty good job with it. Mark Van Oppen. Okay, so the point is that the same thing that happens to Joe Bonham in Johnny Got His Gun happens to Mandela here, which is that he loses his body, and he gets a leg back, but he doesn't get his leg back. And by the time we arrive in the third part of the book, he's essentially feels that he's been fully replaced. And of course he's lost Mary Gay, his last sort of contact with the world that is meaningful to him. The rest of it's sort of, not really that meaningful. Okay, so have a look at the way that, again, to go back to the Institute for Silver Nanotechnology, the way that medicine is built right into the suit. And this is part of keeping the body alive, right? So here's one of their scenarios that comes up in ISN. Okay, here you go. Okay, just another note about this. These particular clips have a loud sound, so you may want to turn down your sound for this one. There's one more coming. I think I use it next lecture, in the final lecture. So I'll post a little notice, but watch out for your sound. As I say, R.I.P. headphones.
Tree, 20 October. Benson and I were on recon looking for enemy probes. His visor was up when the shell blew right on top of us. By the time he got the visor down, the alarms were going off. I knew it was really bad stuff. The protective systems within Benson's uniform would have to work and work well. I switched to monitor Benson over the battlefield network. The drama unfolding in my view screen was riveting. The training films told us how it all works, how the detector can analyze chemical and biological agents, how it matches a huge database of millions of chemicals and organisms, and figures out what to do as a first response. And as the match was made, a tiny system was able to prepare an antidote, inject it into his bloodstream, and neutralize the threat. Scary, but I think he'll sleep well tonight.
So the focus of this project is to try to protect the soldier in the field by developing a way to be able to detect antigens and toxins from biological agents and be able to rapidly deliver an antidote to the soldier in the field.
So the logic here suggests, and this is the kind of thing which we don't necessarily see happening, but if your suit can handle what is called NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical warfare, and you're okay in it, then why don't you use those weapons? So this is the danger, in the same way that if you could get everybody, into an underground bunker, why wouldn't you have a nuclear war? Well, you'd kill the Earth. It's like, okay, that's a good check. That's a good reason for not having one. But the same thing is true here. It's like, well, yeah, but wait. What if we put on our suits and we gas the enemy? And then when they're all dead, we'll take our suits off. Or we'll walk around in them full time. We'll just keep the visors raised. And so this is the thing, you can't say that won't happen. It's like, oh, of course, making suits is always a good idea. It's like, right, but as soon as you've got the protective gear, you may very well use it to essentially then wage war, which you otherwise would not wage. Okay. The suits and all of this stuff is connected to a technology which we're now actually using. It's in its raw early stages. It's been around for at least 10 years. Yeah. And this is called brain-machine interface technology, BMIs. And the brain-machine interface, the initial studies were done with mice and rats, of course. But then eventually they get to the higher primates and they're like, yeah, let's drill into the brain. So sure enough, they do that. And so you'll see monkeys with a box on their heads. Like the box on their heads protects a wire that goes down into the brain. And the okay, it's very hard to step around the ethics of this. I mean, it's just you can't. there are no ethics. But anyway, so what that means is that you can train. In this case, they trained these intelligent apes to look at screens and essentially get used to the motion. So I'm going to show you a little animation here. I'll show it to you the first time, and you'll see the chimp moving the ape moving a joystick, and she's trying to get a ball into a socket, basically, or to a target. And then she puts her hand down, and the joystick disappears. And she goes on getting the ball into the target. Why? Right? So, and you'll see this sort of connection, this kind of little, this is just an illustration, basically, of, this strange, she's got the box on her head is connected to this machine to an arm, which is doing the thing. Okay, so have a look at this clip, then I'll come back. Okay, so having had a look at that clip, here's what's going on, right? Her arm muscles went completely quiet. So this is actually from the study, and these are notes from the study. She kept her arm at her side, and she controlled the robot arm using only her brain and visual feedback. Our analyses of the brain signals showed that the animal learned to assimilate the robot arm into her brain as if it were her own arm. Okay, this is why brain-machine interfaces are considered to be the next big thing. And they have been used for people who are disabled, who are paralyzed, who then learn to, say, look at a monitor. So they people have full body paralysis, but they can move their eyes. And so they hook up the same kind of brain-machine interface connected to you've got to have a machine that interpolates the signal, basically. That is, interprets the signal. And so you're trying to connect something to that. If you can do that, and you can do it repeatedly to the extent that you learn to use your eyes or the mouse, basically, then if you say blink, you'd click or double click. If you can do that, then you can drive a computer. If you can drive a computer, you can write. And so the world starts to open up a little bit. What if you could use a weapon? What if you could use a different weapon suite with your eyes and others with your arms? And this is something which has now been working. I talked to a guy, it must have been 2003, who had been training. He was flying at the time without any. He'd learned to fly using a vest, which has tactors in it. So they basically so he would lean, and the vest would pick up the muscles that were moving. And so if he was leaning to the left or right, and it would, the plane would tip one way or the other. So he actually, there's footage of him with his goggles blacked out, so there's no visual feedback. He was an experienced pilot, but he had this tactor vest. So if he was flying straight, the vest would be quiet. And if he started, if the plane started leaning one way or the other, the tactors would start tapping, and he would okay, and he would lean over the other way, that kind of thing. So you could fly literally if you were blind. That's the idea. They began then to train young men to game with these things, and instead of using hand controls for gaming, especially first-person shooters, they began to train people with these vests, which would have these overall tactors, and so that they could then fire weapons using, say, part of the torso muscles. So you don't have to take up the hands with holding a weapon. well, then you can do all kinds of other things. And so it took them a week or so. When I was talking to him, he was telling me that it took them a week. They put these, they of course, they brought in these two squads of 18-year-olds to game it against each other. And one squad, they let them go on gaming with their hands and eyes as usual. And the other squad, they trained them to game with the vest. And so for the first week, of course, the guys with the vest lost. And then they began to gain back ground. And within another few days, they were slaughtering the guys who were using hand-eye coordination all the time, because these people got to react much more quickly. And of course, they got to really love it. Okay. So this concept of making the body overall into a weapon is something which we're there. It just hasn't all come together yet the way I've shown you pieces of it here. Right? And so on page 99, Mandela says, the maintenance man was a double traumatic amputation, only lived for a few minutes, we're keeping him running for transplants. And so basically, unlike Joe Bonham, where you keep the body alive just to prove you can keep the body alive, here you keep the body alive because you're going to use it for resupply. And so it has a completely different meaning, right? Remember, kilocalories. The body is an investment. Again, I look back to World War I, and it's astonishing how many of these issues came up in World War I, and we didn't really know to connect them because the dots weren't there to be connected yet. But when you go back and look at the literature, you're like, oh, Jesus, look at this. So Robert Graves is a famous author, poet, wrote a book called Goodbye to All That, which is his own experience in World War I. And it's beautifully written. I mean, Graves is an incredible writer. And at the end of the war, he says, one day I met a major. I saluted him. Taking me aside, he muttered confidentially, it's nice of you to salute me, my boy, but I must confess I am not what I seem. I've got a sergeant major's stomach. I was busy dying, but as soon as ever the sergeant major died, they took out that long gut, and they put it into me and grafted it on somehow. Wonderful chaps, these medicos. They supply spare parts as though the one were a motor car. Jesus. So what we've got is that what the sergeant major now was a colonel, now is a sergeant major, has lost his identity as far as he's concerned. So here's a young lieutenant, Graves, who salutes the colonel, and the colonel's like, oh, no, I'm no longer a colonel because I've been demoted, because I have somebody else's parts. And so there's this sense, and this, remember, would have been 1919, of having lost the self because of this transition of the body. Right? So the ex-major, sorry, not colonel, the ex-major busy dying did actually die. He is no longer a major. He is no longer deserving a grave salute. And so there's very little left now for the self to cling to.